The old house looked exactly as I remembered, nestled in the gentle hills with fields stretching wide, once lush and vibrant. The memory of summers spent here washed over me as I parked the car and took in the sight of my grandmother Rose's beloved field of sunflowers. But what I saw wasn't what I remembered. Instead of the tall, radiant flowers I used to run through as a child, I found rows of wilted stalks, their once bright faces now bent and shriveled. The sight unsettled me. I had avoided this place for years, pushing memories of it to the back of my mind. And now, standing here, I felt both nostalgia and a strange heaviness that seemed to press down on me with every step I took toward the house. I'd come back to organize my grandmother's things and prepare the property for sale, something I'd put off for months after her passing. Inside, the house was exactly as she'd left it, filled with the familiar smell of old wood and lavender sachets. Her books, her knitting basket, and even her gardening hat were all in their places, as if she'd just stepped out and would be back any minute. Setting my bags down, I wandered through the rooms, running my fingers along the furniture, feeling both comforted and haunted by the past. My memories of Grandma Rose were warm but somehow laced with shadows. She'd always been kind, but there was a seriousness about her that, as a child, I couldn't understand. She'd taught me to respect the land, especially the sunflower field, saying it was special and not like other places. As I walked through the kitchen, I noticed a small leather-bound notebook lying on the counter. It was one I remembered her carrying, always tucked under her arm or slipped into her gardening apron. Curious, I picked it up, surprised to see her spidery handwriting filling the pages. Flipping through the first few entries, I felt a pang of sadness. The notes were simple, filled with gardening tips and observations about the changing seasons. She wrote about the soil, the weather, and the plants she tended, always with a deep reverence for the land. I could almost hear her voice, calm and wise, telling me that the land speaks to us if we're willing to listen. But as I continued reading, I found entries that struck a different tone. She mentioned things I didn't remember her ever saying, phrases like keeping the field alive and maintaining the balance. In one entry she wrote, "The sunflowers need more than soil and sunlight. They require offerings to stay strong, to keep the energy of the field vibrant." A chill ran down my spine. I had never heard her speak this way, as if the field of sunflowers were more than just a field, as if it was something alive, something that demanded her attention and devotion in a way I couldn't understand. I felt the urge to close the notebook, to put it away and pretend I hadn't read it. But a part of me needed to know more. This place had always felt mysterious, even when I was a child. I remembered running through the sunflower field and feeling as though I were being watched, as if the flowers themselves had eyes that followed me. Setting the notebook aside, I went to the front door and looked out at the field, which stretched under the setting sun, casting long shadows across the dry earth. The rows of wilted sunflowers stood silent, as if waiting, their heads bent like they were in mourning. In that moment, I understood why I had stayed away for so long. There was something here, something I'd sensed as a child but had never been able to put into words. I took a deep breath, resolving to uncover whatever secrets my grandmother had left behind. The house was quiet, but as I prepared to turn in for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if the house itself, or perhaps the field outside, was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something. I didn't know what. Lying in bed, I felt a strange heaviness settle over me, the kind of weight that comes with old secrets and forgotten memories. And as I drifted off to sleep, the last image that lingered in my mind was of the sunflowers, standing silent and watchful under the night sky. The next morning, I woke up feeling unsettled, my dreams fragmented and filled with images of the sunflower field, its wilted stalks stretching endlessly under a grey sky, the flowers' heads turning to watch me no matter where I stood. I tried to shake off the eerie feeling, telling myself it was just a dream. But the strange words in my grandmother's notebook lingered in my mind. I took my coffee and the notebook outside, hoping that some fresh air would make it easier to go through her notes. Sitting on the old wooden porch, I opened the notebook to where I'd left off, bracing myself for whatever secrets my grandmother might have recorded. At first, the entries were similar to what I'd read before, filled with gardening advice and observations about the seasons. But as I turned the pages, her words grew more cryptic. She wrote of nourishing the land and keeping the spirits appeased. Each entry was carefully dated, and as the years passed, her tone became more intense, almost anxious. One entry stood out to me, written in shaky handwriting. "The field is weakening. The flowers no longer bloom as they once did. I fear I may have neglected the offerings, and they are displeased. The land remembers, and it demands its due." My heart pounded as I read her words. Offerings. Spirits. This didn't sound like the practical woman I'd known. She had always been grounded, her connection to the land more about respect than fear. But here she wrote as if she were bound to something ancient and insistent, something that demanded more from her than just care. I closed the notebook, staring out at the field, now dull and lifeless in the daylight. I remembered running through those flowers as a child, laughing, unaware of anything but the joy of summer and the beauty of the sunflowers stretching toward the sky. Had there been more to the field even back then, something I hadn't been able to understand? The thought sent a chill through me. My grandmother had called this field special, but I'd never thought much of it. To me, it had just been a beautiful place, a natural part of our summers together. Now, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd been blind to something darker, something I'd sensed without realizing. Later that afternoon, as I continued going through her things, I came across a small wooden box tucked away in her bedroom closet. Inside, I found various trinkets, old coins, stones, and dried herbs tied with twine. Each item felt intentional, as though they had been placed there with care. They looked like offerings, the kind I'd seen in books on folklore, used to honor or appease spirits of the land. I thought back to her notebook. Could these items be connected to the offerings she'd mentioned? That evening, I returned to the notebook, reading with a new sense of urgency. My grandmother's words painted a picture that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. She described the field as something alive, something that needed her, but also something that gave back to her in return, a connection she believed was passed down through our family. She spoke of the land as if it were a partner in a pact, something that thrived as long as she kept her promises. In one of the last entries, she wrote, "The balance must be maintained. The field requires offerings, small sacrifices to keep its strength. Without them, the flowers fade, the land dies. I have seen what happens when the pact is broken, and I cannot allow that to happen again." I put the notebook down, my hands shaking. The pact. The word echoed in my mind, bringing with it a sense of dread. Was my grandmother bound by some agreement with the land? And if so, what exactly had she sacrificed to keep the field alive? I remembered stories I'd heard as a child, rumors passed down by people in the town. Whispers about my grandmother, about her strange connection to the land, about the prosperity she enjoyed even when others struggled. At the time, I dismissed them as superstitions, tales told by people who didn't understand her. But now, reading her words, I wondered if there had been some truth to them. By nightfall, I was too uneasy to stay inside. I grabbed a flashlight and walked out to the edge of the field, the wilted sunflowers looming like silent sentinels under the darkening sky. The field was eerily quiet, the air thick and still. I could feel something there, an energy that pulsed beneath the surface, ancient and almost alive. Standing there, I thought I heard a whisper, faint and barely audible, like a breath carried on the wind. It could have been the rustle of dry stalks, but it felt different, as if the land itself were trying to speak to me. My grandmother's words returned to me, her warnings about keeping the balance, about making offerings to the field. I felt a strange, irrational urge to do something, to leave an offering, to make peace with whatever was waiting there. But I forced myself to turn away, retreating back to the house with a mixture of fear and disbelief. As I lay in bed, the weight of her words pressed down on me. I couldn't ignore the sense that she had left this knowledge for me intentionally, that she'd wanted me to understand something fundamental about the land and about our family. That night, my dreams were filled with visions of the field, stretching endlessly under a dark sky, the flowers withered, yet somehow alive, bending toward me as if expecting something. And for the first time, I wondered if my grandmother had truly left, or if part of her was still there, lingering in the shadows of the sunflower field. The following days passed in a haze, my every thought circling back to the notebook and the strange practices my grandmother had written about. Her words unsettled me, lingering in my mind like a question I couldn't answer. Had her love for the sunflower field been something more, a connection tied to a responsibility she'd never spoken of? That night, sleep came slowly, the weight of the field pressing down on me even from a distance. Eventually, I drifted off, only to find myself in a vivid dream, standing among the sunflowers. They were tall and radiant, just as I remembered them from childhood, their faces turned toward a deep blue sky. But then, the scene shifted. The flowers drooped, their golden faces fading to gray, and the sky darkened. I could feel a presence around me, watchful and expectant. In the dream, I saw my grandmother, standing in the field, her back to me. She was speaking, her voice soft but insistent, as though she were having a conversation with someone just out of sight. I tried to move closer, to hear what she was saying, but I couldn't. The sunflowers began to sway around me, though there was no wind, their movements sharp and unnatural, like they were closing in. My grandmother's voice grew fainter, her figure fading into the shadows as I tried to reach her. I called out, but no sound came. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The dream had felt so real, like a memory more than a nightmare. I lay there in the dark, feeling as if I was still in the field, the weight of the sunflowers bearing down on me. The next morning, I went to the field, driven by a need to see it in the daylight, to make sense of the dream. The flowers looked even worse up close, wilted and lifeless, their heads bent and browned, as if they were mourning something I couldn't see. The silence was thick, and I could feel an invisible barrier as I stepped into the rows, as though I were crossing into a place where I wasn't welcome. My grandmother's notebook was tucked under my arm, and I clutched it tightly, feeling its weight as I moved deeper into the field. The rows stretched out around me, the dry stalks brushing against my arms, creating a soft rustling sound that made me feel as if I were surrounded by whispers. About halfway into the field, I stopped, a sudden stillness settling over me. I felt an urge to open the notebook, as though I were meant to read her words here, in this place she had so carefully tended. I turned to a page toward the back, one I hadn't read before. The entry was brief, her handwriting uneven, as if she'd written it in a hurry. I must pass this to you, Clara. The field demands more each year, its strength fading, its spirit restless. It is no longer enough to simply tend it. It requires acknowledgement, offerings to appease the land. I fear it will not accept just anyone. It wants one who understands. You must decide what to give, for if the balance breaks, the field may turn. A chill ran down my spine. The field may turn? What did that mean? Her words hinted at something dangerous, something I wasn't prepared for. I felt a surge of resentment, wondering why she hadn't told me any of this while she was alive. Why had she kept me in the dark, only to leave this burden for me to find on my own? As I stood there, lost in thought, I heard a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic rustling. I looked around, but there was no one. The sunflowers swayed slightly, though the air was still, and I felt that eerie sensation again, as though I were being watched. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A dark figure flitted between the rows a few yards away, moving deeper into the field. I froze, every muscle tensing, my mind racing. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the light, but something in me knew it wasn't. The figure felt familiar, as if it was someone I'd seen before. Compelled by a mixture of fear and curiosity, I followed, winding my way through the rows. The figure stayed just ahead, always a few steps beyond my reach, slipping in and out of sight between the sunflowers. I felt a strange pull, as though I were being led somewhere, drawn deeper into the field's secrets. At last, the figure disappeared around a bend in the rows, and I emerged into a small clearing at the heart of the field. The space felt different, heavy with an energy I couldn't explain. At the center of the clearing, half buried in the dirt, lay a small bundle wrapped in cloth, old and weathered, as though it had been placed there long ago. With trembling hands, I knelt and brushed the dirt away, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a collection of items. A coin, a dried flower, a lock of hair tied with a faded ribbon. Each piece felt personal, like something that had once belonged to someone, a small piece of their life left behind. A wave of realization washed over me. These weren't just offerings, they were remnants, tokens that tied the lives of others to this place. I remembered her words about the field requiring sacrifices, about maintaining balance through offerings. Had these items been placed here as a way to honor that balance, to appease whatever spirit or force resided within the land? Suddenly, I felt the weight of the field's gaze upon me, an unspoken demand. It was as though it wanted me to add something of my own, to carry on my grandmother's ritual, to feed the land with another offering. But I couldn't. The thought of leaving something of mine, of binding myself to the field in the way my grandmother had, filled me with dread. I stood up, clutching the notebook to my chest, backing away from the clearing as the silence closed in around me. I returned to the house, shaken, my mind swirling with questions and a growing sense of urgency. I couldn't ignore the feeling that my grandmother had left this for me to find, that she had expected me to continue her work, to keep the pact she had forged with the land. But the weight of that responsibility terrified me. I didn't know if I could bear it, or if I even wanted to. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the wind pick up, carrying the faint rustle of the dry sunflowers outside. The sound was soft at first, then louder, like the whispering of voices just outside my window, calling me back to the field. And as I drifted into a fitful sleep, I felt a presence, hovering just at the edge of my consciousness, waiting for me to make a choice. The next morning, I awoke with a feeling of heaviness, as though the weight of the field itself had settled over me. The previous day's discoveries had left me reeling, yet I felt an undeniable pull to return to the field, to face whatever secrets my grandmother had left hidden among the withered stalks. Taking a deep breath, I walked outside, the morning sun casting a pale light over the field. The sunflowers looked lifeless in the daylight, their dried petals fluttering faintly, their heads still bowed. I felt like I was stepping into a different world as I moved among them, their silence oppressive, almost expectant. I didn't go directly to the clearing where I'd found the bundle the day before. Instead, I wandered through the rows, guided by a strange instinct. As I walked, memories surfaced, half-forgotten summers of running through these flowers, laughing, unaware of anything but the joy of those moments. Yet now, with the knowledge of my grandmother's pact, those memories felt tinged with a darkness I hadn't seen before. The farther I walked, the heavier the air grew, as though something unseen were pressing down on me, watching my every step. I tried to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. The balance must be maintained. Without it, the field may turn. It was then that I noticed a patch of the field where the flowers seemed even more decayed than the rest, their stalks blackened and twisted. The sight unsettled me, and I approached it cautiously, feeling as though I were trespassing in a place not meant for me. At the center of the patch, half hidden by the dead flowers, I found a stone marker, weathered and worn. The initials carved into it were faint but unmistakable, R.J. My grandmother's initials. Kneeling down, I brushed away the dirt surrounding the stone, revealing a small iron box embedded in the earth. My heart pounded as I pried it open, my fingers trembling. Inside, I found more of the items I'd seen in the bundle the day before. Trinkets, small personal items that seemed to hold fragments of lives once lived. Beneath them was a folded piece of parchment, its edges brittle with age. Carefully, I opened it, my breath catching as I read the faded handwriting. It was a letter from my grandmother, written in the same careful script as her notebook entries. Clara, if you are reading this, then the field has called to you, as it once called to me. This land holds more than memories. It holds the spirits of those who came before us, those who nurtured it and, in turn, were nurtured by it. We are bound to it, you and I, tied by a lineage that demands our loyalty and our care. I felt a shiver as I read her words, the weight of her expectations settling over me. She had left this for me, knowing I would one day return, knowing I would find the secrets she'd hidden here. I continued reading, each line filling me with a deeper sense of dread. The field requires offerings to stay alive, to maintain the energy that sustains it. This was my duty, as it was the duty of those who came before me. I have kept the pact, but I grow weary, and I fear the field's strength is waning. It may ask more of you, as it did of me. What you choose to give will determine its future, and yours." The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears. My grandmother had carried this burden alone, bound to a land that demanded her devotion, her sacrifices. She had kept this from me, from everyone, protecting us from the truth until she was gone. And now, she was asking me to take her place, to continue her work. I felt anger rise in me, mixed with sorrow and confusion. Why had she done this? Why had she dedicated her life to a field of flowers, to a pact that seemed more like a curse than a blessing? I thought of the townspeople, their whispered rumors about her, the strange respect they'd shown her. Had they known? Had they been aware of what she'd been doing here, year after year? I folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the box. Standing there, surrounded by the blackened sunflowers, I felt the weight of generations pressing down on me. The field was quiet, but I could sense its presence, its silent expectation, as if waiting for me to act. In that moment, I knew I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. My grandmother had made her choice, bound by her belief in the pact. But I was different. I didn't want this responsibility, this legacy that demanded sacrifices and secrecy. The anger inside me solidified into resolve. I wouldn't continue her pact. I wouldn't allow myself to be bound by something I didn't believe in, something that had taken her life and twisted it into something haunted. I made my way back to the house, my thoughts racing. That night, as darkness fell, I gathered kindling, gasoline, and matches. The field was waiting, its silence deeper than ever, the weight of its secrets pressing down on me as I moved among the rows, spreading the kindling around the blackened flowers, pouring gasoline in careful lines. The smell filled the air, sharp and bitter. I struck a match, holding it for a moment, watching the flame flicker before I let it drop. The fire spread quickly, the flames licking up the dry stalks, consuming the field row by row. As I watched, the fire lit up the night, the smoke rising in thick clouds. I felt an overwhelming sense of release, as if I were burning away not just the flowers, but the legacy my grandmother had left behind. I was letting go of her pact, breaking free from the chains of the past. The flames danced, their heat warming my skin as I stood at the edge of the field, watching it all go up in smoke. I could almost feel her presence there, a faint warmth beside me, not angry, not disappointed, but accepting, as if she'd known this might be my choice. The fire burned until dawn, leaving nothing but ashes in its wake. I stood there as the first light broke over the hills, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders, a sense of peace settling over me. I had freed myself from her pact, from the shadows of the field, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. The morning after the fire, the field was unrecognizable. Where rows of wilted sunflowers had once stood, there was now only a blackened expanse of ash, stretching out under a gray sky. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, mixing with the dampness of morning dew, and I breathed it in, feeling a strange calm settle over me. The weight that had haunted me since my arrival was gone. The field was silent in a way it had never been before, no longer pressing down on me with unseen demands. It was as though the spirits bound to it, the shadows of my grandmother's legacy, had finally been set free. I walked through the remnants of the field, my footsteps soft in the ash, and felt the emptiness around me like a bomb. I wasn't sure if my grandmother would have approved of what I'd done, but standing there, I had the sense that she understood. I could almost feel her presence beside me, a gentle warmth, a quiet acceptance. She had left this choice to me, perhaps knowing that I would do what she could not. With a last look at the land, I returned to the house. It felt different now, lighter, like a burden had been lifted from its walls. I spent the morning packing up her things, sorting through memories both sweet and haunting, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and relief. As I placed the last of her belongings in a box, I found myself drawn to her old notebook one more time. Flipping through its worn pages, I no longer felt the same sense of dread. Instead, I felt a deep respect for the life she'd chosen, the sacrifices she'd made to protect the family in the way she believed best. I had walked her path, if only for a moment, And I understood now how deeply she'd loved this land, how much she'd been willing to give. Setting the notebook on the shelf, I took one final look around the house, my gaze lingering on the familiar corners that had once been filled with her presence. She was gone, truly gone now, but I felt that she was at peace. And so was I. I stepped outside, feeling the cool air brush against my skin, and looked out over the field one last time. The landscape was bare, transformed, no longer haunted by shadows or secrets. I realized I'd broken more than just a pact. I'd broken free from a legacy I hadn't chosen, from a history that had held me captive in ways I hadn't understood until now. As I walked to my car, I felt a lightness I hadn't known before. I was no longer bound to the past, to the secrets hidden in rows of sunflowers. I was free to create my own life, my own legacy, untouched by the shadows that had clung to my grandmother and to this place. Driving away, I glanced back once more, taking in the house and the blackened field. They grew smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror, until finally they vanished from sight, leaving only open road ahead. I didn't know where I would go from here, but I knew that whatever came next, it would be mine, and mine alone.